Hey everyone, we are on chapter 13 this week, the first chapter of the last unit, Unit 5. So we are coming near the end here, and chapters 13, 14, and 15 are going to be all about the Civil War, sort of like the before, the during, and the after. So chapter 13 is going to be the before the Civil War, I'm calling it the road to Civil War. And make sure that if you haven't yet, that you check out the announcement that I posted regarding chapter 13, because it looks a little different as far as the reading for chapter 13, and I explained that in the most recent announcement that I posted. So with chapter 13, we're going to start out, I'm just going to remind you of a few earlier examples of sectionalism, earlier examples of ways that tension started to develop between the North and the South, because these examples are going to come back around either this chapter or next chapter when looking at the causes for the Civil War breaking out. And so the first major example of sectionalism was one that was able to find a resolution, at least a temporary resolution, pretty quickly, and that was the Missouri Compromise. Remember that when Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, Northerners were against this because this would upset the balance between slave states and free states in Congress, giving slave states an advantage. So our great compromiser, Henry Clay, came up with an idea, a solution. He said, let's add Missouri as a slave state. We'll balance it out by adding a new free state, and we will call it Maine. And then finally, let's draw a boundary line so that we don't have to have this discussion again. And from this point forward, anything above the boundary line, which is going to be right here, this red line, the 3630 parallel, anything above the boundary line will be free territory, no slavery allowed. Anything below will be slave territory. So that temporarily resolved the conflict, but don't forget that Thomas Jefferson quote in which he said, news of this compromise and news of this crisis and this compromise woke him up like a fire bell in the night. This was the first event to really show the cracks that were forming in the Union and what was eventually going to break us. Another thing was the nullification crisis, and that was under Andrew Jackson. So if you remember South Carolina, like most southern states, South Carolina was opposed to tariffs in general, but Congress had just passed a particularly high tariff, and South Carolina used that old argument back that the Democratic Republicans had used a long time ago during Adams's presidency. South Carolina uses that old argument of nullification, that if a state disagrees with a federal law or finds it to be maybe unconstitutional, that the state could nullify or ignore the law. And South Carolina even went as far as to threaten to secede from the Union if they were not able to nullify it. This crisis was ended in a couple of different ways. One, by a show of force with Andrew Jackson, who responded to John Calhoun, who had been his vice president and now is kind of leading this call to nullify and secede. Jackson's response to John C. Calhoun was, go ahead, try it, but that's treason, and so me and the army will just come down and hang you if you try to secede. That was Jackson's response, and that kind of put an end to the issue, but also we could count on old Henry Clay to come through, and he was able to work out a deal that involved the tariff slowly decreasing over time that made both sides, North and South, happy for a time. But again, this issue of can states nullify federal laws and can states secede legally is kind of shown fully in this event as well. And then the Mexican-American War, just from last chapter, is going to be an example of increased sectionalism. And honestly, annexing Texas would go along with this too for the same reasons. Northerners saw both of those events, annexing Texas and provoking the Mexican-American War, as just a way to extend slavery. Northerners knew that President Polk wanted to gain those territories in order to extend slavery, and this created more tension between Northerners and Southerners. So remember that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War added this territory, this green territory right here, called the Mexican Cession. And this is going to be what Ralph Waldo Emerson called like taking a dose of arsenic. It's going to poison our country by adding this territory. And turns out that in just a few short years later, about 11 years later, we will be at war, Civil War. So part of the Mexican Cession, apologize for this typo right here, part of the Mexican Cession was California, which even before, or kind of around the same time that the Mexican-American War was kind of happening and ending and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, around the same time California was experiencing the gold rush and its population had exploded and they had enough population to apply to be a state. And California requested to be a free state. This brings us back to that same problem from 1820. It would upset the balance in Congress between slave states and free states. And so this time, there's yet another compromise made. It's literally called the Compromise of 1850. One other issue that's going to come up in this compromise, forgot about this one, was involving Texas. You might recognize this kind of wonky Texas shape as this is the land that Texas originally claimed as the Republic of Texas, and Texas is still trying to claim this land as a state in the Union. Can you imagine if Texas actually got its way and got to have that shape? But the federal government did not believe that Texas had claim to all of that land. Instead, they said Texas's boundaries were the modern boundaries we have today, this green area. And so this dispute between Texas and the federal government had to be settled as well. So who are we going to call for a solution? We're going to call the great compromiser Henry Clay. And so he came up with a 5-part solution. We're going to go through each one of these parts because they are all very significant and very important. And so the first part of the Compromise of 1850 was that California would enter the Union as a free state. Now, as far as adding a slave state to the Union or other slave states to the Union, just hold on. They're going to kind of change the process of how a state or a territory becomes either slave or free. The next part of the Compromise of 1850 was related to Washington, D.C. If you remember back in the Constitutional Convention, the Founding Fathers had agreed to end the international slave trade or end U.S. participation in the international slave trade. America would no longer be bringing in slaves from Africa. However, there was still a significant internal slave trade, of course, meaning people would buy and sell enslaved people within the United States. And so one of the places where this was still happening was in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. In fact, Washington, D.C. had one of the largest slave trade markets in the country. And a lot of people were opposed to this activity in particular happening in the nation's capital. So part of the Compromise of 1850, this was kind of a win for the Northerners, was to abolish the slave trade market in Washington, D.C. Now, weirdly, Washington, D.C. was still going to be a territory that allowed slavery, just no longer the buying and selling of slaves. A huge win for the South and a huge loss for the North is going to be the third part of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. This wasn't the first fugitive slave law. There had been versions of fugitive slave laws in place for, since the beginning. But this fugitive slave law is going to have a few differences that we'll go over in just a second. Fourth, in the territories that made up the Mexican Cession other than California, so besides California, the Mexican Cession was divided up into the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. So for these territories, instead of establishing for them whether they would be slave or free, part of the Compromise of 1850 was a suggestion that it was decided through popular sovereignty. And so the residents of these territories would get to vote whether they wanted to be a slave territory or a free territory. And as the fifth part of the compromise, Texas would give up the land that it was claiming, that was disputed, and it would take on the shape that Texas has now. That was the fifth part of the compromise. These are the same 5 components, just kind of broken down and accompanied by this map. Depending on what place it's referring to, you've got California over here entering as a free state. Utah, New Mexico territories get to decide slavery through popular sovereignty. Texas gave up some of its territory. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. And then finally, just in general, because this is going to affect the North, in general, the Fugitive Slave Act is going to impact the North. And so speaking of the Fugitive Slave Act, again, it wasn't the first time that this type of law had been in place, but the law was strengthened, particularly the consequences for not following the law were increased. And so according to the new Fugitive Slave Act law, it required anyone, even Northerners and free states, if they were called upon to assist in hunting down or capturing, taking into custody someone who is suspected to be a fugitive slave, a runaway slave, anyone who was called upon to help do this would have to do it. Any citizen had to assist in capturing runaway slaves. If a federal official came up and said, hey, you, go catch that guy for me, they had to. It also imposed penalties on anyone who was involved in helping enslaved people escape slavery. And so the Underground Railroad is becoming very significant at this point, and it was definitely targeted by the Fugitive Slave Act. Anybody involved in that could face major penalties. Another thing that happened was that fugitive slaves were not entitled to a trial with a jury if they were denying that they were slaves. And so, for example, maybe there was a free Black American in the North who was accused of being a fugitive slave, accused of being a runaway slave. He's taken into custody. He says, no, I'm a free man. I can prove it. Too bad. He doesn't get the opportunity to prove it in a trial. And so this opens the door, or at least a trial with a jury who might actually rule in his favor. So this opens the door to the risk of any Black American, even if they've never set foot in the South, maybe being captured and sent into slavery. This cartoon is, well, for one thing, it's pretty creepy, particularly this face, human face on this dog body. But if you notice all the symbolism going on in the background, you have some what appear to be runaway slaves who have been caught by a dog. And if you notice, these other dogs are labeled Ohio and Indiana, and they are making their way towards Canada. And so you've got this guy over here saying, seize him, ordering these northern states, aka hunting dogs, to track down the runaway slaves who are headed to Canada. The caption uses the word servility, meaning this is very much a northern perspective. The Northerners felt like they were being taken advantage of, that they were being used in the hunting of slaves, something that they wanted nothing to do with. And so they felt this was very much a violation of their rights and freedoms, and even made them complicit, part of the evil of slavery overall. The Fugitive Slave Act was by far the most controversial and upsetting part of the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so moving on from that sets into motion a lot of things that are going to start happening. But let's take a look for a second at what's going on politically and with political parties. We already talked about how the abolitionist movement is going to grow and change, beginning back in the 1830s when William Lloyd Garrison first published The Liberator. The abolitionist movement is going to take on more of a tone of radicalism, and it's going to change its message. Prior to this radicalism, abolitionists would have been, probably would have been more in favor of what's called gradual emancipation. So maybe not emancipating enslaved people immediately, but something like their children, when their children turn 18, can gain their freedom. And so that's different than immediate emancipation, which would immediately end slavery and free every slaves. So prior to the 1830s, a lot of abolitionists kind of saw this as the more practical way to go. Not immediately ending slavery, but gradual emancipation. But by the time we get to the 1830s, abolitionists have kind of upped their game a little bit. They're calling for more. And these abolitionists are now calling for not only emancipation, not only immediate emancipation, but also for free Black Americans to have full and equal rights in society. Now, this was a very radical message. We're going to look at several examples of people who are anti-slavery, but they're not necessarily as radical as wanting full racial equality. That's about as radical as it gets. But we see more and more of those voices advocating for full racial equality starting to speak up in the 1850s. Including, and this is sort of indirectly, but including a novel that was published in 1852 that galvanized the abolitionist movement. It helped the movement to gain followers, helped them to become more radical. And this novel, which was fiction but based on real life, was a depiction of slave life. It was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was set on a southern plantation. The main characters were slaves. And it was written by a northern white woman who was an abolitionist, and she meant to portray several things. She wanted to portray, first of all, the horrors of slavery, which unfortunately at that point some northerners might not have been fully aware of the circumstances of slavery and the things that they endured. So she wanted to portray the horrors of slavery. She also wanted to portray the humanity of these enslaved laborers. She made them characters that people could relate to. She humanized them for people. And so this was a huge boost for the abolitionist movement, and it became a best-selling novel in America. Remember, we're talking about politics and slavery, and so another anti-slavery political party actually emerges during this time. However, they are not abolitionists. And so I'm going to explain that difference real clearly in just a second here. But the party was called the Free Soil Party. And actually, weirdly, it was established by a former president. Martin Van Buren had already been president for the Democratic Party, and now he's trying to establish this Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party mainly concerned themselves with the expansion of slavery into new territory, so Western territory. The Free Soil Party did not want to see slavery expand into these Western territories like Kansas Territory, Nebraska, Utah, New Mexico, because, and this wasn't because they opposed slavery from a moral standpoint, it wasn't because they had a problem with slavery morally. It was because they believed that if slavery were allowed to extend into the West would basically become just like the South, taken over by large plantation owners, controlled by the few, the wealthy, the elite, and that your smaller farmers, or even maybe some of your immigrants that are still coming to the United States, would have no opportunity in the West. We'd have these vast lands that could provide so much opportunity for your small independent farmer, but if you allow slavery to get into the West, then it's just going to be taken over by plantation owners. And so the Free Soil Party wanted to look out for those smaller independent farmers and keep the West open to opportunities for them. And so when we're looking at them side by side, Free Soilers versus abolitionists, they both opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Of course, abolitionists did. But abolitionists wanted to see slavery also end immediately. And at this time, the more radical of the abolitionists were also calling for full rights and freedoms for Black Americans. So the biggest difference here is going to be that Free Soilers were not calling to end slavery where it already existed. The Free Soilers were not calling on the South to end slavery. They simply wanted to prevent slavery from expanding anywhere else but the South. So this whole issue kind of blows up. Literally, it's going to turn into a violent issue with something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was proposed by a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. And actually, the funny thing is, this act and the ramifications of it become all about slavery. But initially, Stephen Douglas proposed this act and for a reason that was unrelated to slavery. In fact, it was related to a railroad. And so part of I guess what you could say is left of the Louisiana Purchase at this point is going to be the Nebraska and Kansas territories that kind of show up here on this bottom map a little bit. And you're looking at this top map, this whole chunk called unorganized territory, that's going to be your Kansas and Nebraska territory, or what becomes your Kansas and Nebraska territory. So here's why this mattered. Stephen Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, so a railroad that would go across the entire United States. A lot of people wanted this. Stephen Douglas had a particular interest in the railroad taking a more northern route that would pass through his state of Illinois, Illinois being right here. And so in order to get his way, he knew that the issue of slavery, he knew that the railroad would end up passing through these unorganized territories, which will become Kansas and Nebraska. And so the issue of slavery was going to need to be decided before plans were put in place to build this railroad. So he proposed a plan that he knew had a piece of it that would be appealing to Southerners to get them to agree with his plan. He said, okay, how about we take this unorganized territory? Oh, wait, let me back up. Stephen Douglas, he knew that according to the Missouri Compromise, this entire unorganized territory technically should be slave-free. Remember, anything above this line, according to the Missouri Compromise, would be free territory. So Stephen A. Douglas, in order to appeal to Southerners, says, hey, let's forget the Missouri Compromise. Forget it. Let's just repeal it. And instead, let's let these territories choose for themselves, just like we did for Utah and New Mexico. Popular sovereignty. So, of course, this is appealing to the Southerners because now, instead of automatically saying these territories are free, it gives the option of potentially opening up these northern territories to slavery. So, of course, Southerners were on board with that, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in Congress. Northerners were very much against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course, because they also believed and they feared that it would result in slavery expanding into these territories. So here's the Kansas and Nebraska territories that were created. And under the Kansas and Nebraska Act, they were going to hold elections to decide whether they would be a slave territory or a free territory. Now, there are two incredibly huge things that happen because of this one piece of legislation. The first is going to be the establishment of the Republican Party, essentially the same Republican Party we have today. Not the same platforms, not the same beliefs. They changed over time, but we are going to get the formation of the modern Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The other thing is going to be an event called Bleeding Kansas, and we'll get to that in just a second. I like these maps because they kind of show everything side by side. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each one slightly changing the rules on how the status of slavery would be determined in each territory. Okay, so like I said, one of the results of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the creation of the modern Republican Party. And so here's how that happened. Because Northerners were against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but Southerners in general were in favor of it, this actually split the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party before this really wasn't based on any type of geographic lines. I'll actually show you a map in just a second that shows you that the Democratic Party at this point, there were Democrats in the North and the South. But over this law, they split and they went in different directions. So the Northern Democrats ended up teaming up with the Whigs, and the Whigs have not really been having very much success lately, and so they needed kind of a change. They teamed up with the Whigs and even some Free Soilers to form the new Republican Party. And so the Republican Party is going to be those Northern Democrats who did not want to see slavery spreading. It's going to be Whigs, and it's also going to be Free Soilers who did not want to see the spread of slavery. So the Republican Party is going to adopt that official platform, not abolishing slavery. And it's hard to make this more clear. The Republican Party, even with the election of Lincoln, they are not going to call for the abolition of slavery, not yet. But they are going to call for the stop of its expansion. So that was what the new Republican Party was founded upon. And then what was left over in the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, they simply become the Democrats. And so if you look in these at these electoral maps, before the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1852, you can see the blue is Democrat, and it's everywhere. And the purplish color is the Whigs. And so it's not north, it's not south, it's just everywhere. There's no pattern really. But by 1856, look how there is a clear pattern. The South is solidly Democrat, and then in the North, we have this new party, the Republican Party, instead of the Whigs. The second consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was something called Bleeding Kansas. So you can tell what's going to happen here. It's going to be a violent event, and it's related to the popular sovereignty issue. Since Kansas and Nebraska were going to get to decide slavery through popular sovereignty, of course that meant they had to hold elections. So when it came time for Kansas to have their elections, remember that Kansas and Missouri share a border. In fact, St. Louis is actually in both states. And so Missouri, being a slave state, had interest in seeing Kansas open up to slavery as well. And so during these elections, pro-slavery people from Missouri snuck across the border into Kansas and secretly voted pro-slavery. When this fraud was discovered, anti-slavery people were outraged, and riots and violence broke out throughout Kansas. And this became known as Bleeding Kansas. In one incident, as many as 200 people lost their lives. And so imagine it as like a little preview of the Civil War, a little mini Civil War in Kansas. And this map kind of shows you the territory in which some of these incidents broke out near the border. Okay, and then in 1857, this didn't get finished here, but this is a Supreme Court ruling in a Supreme Court case called Dred Scott v. Sanford that's going to change everything. That's how that sentence was supposed to end. A Supreme Court ruling will change everything, because it will. It ended up being known as the Dred Scott decision. And so Dred Scott was a slave, and for a portion of his adulthood, for a few years, he had lived with his, for lack of a better word, master, the white person that owned him. He had lived with him in various states, kind of traveled around with him. He wasn't a slave that worked out in fields. He was more of like a servant or an assistant type of slave. He worked for someone who was like a doctor or a lawyer or some professional like that. And so he traveled around a lot. And at one point, Dred Scott found himself in a free state. It was either Illinois or Indiana. So that state was officially, considered free because of the Missouri Compromise. So when he returned to Missouri, which is where he was from, and his owner was from, when they returned to Missouri, he went to the court and said, I lived in a free state, that automatically freed me. My status of a slave disappeared because I was I was living in a free state. That was the argument he was trying to make to the court, that he gained emancipation because he had, if even for just a few years, lived in a free state. So the Supreme Court came back and, as you could guess, did not agree with Dred Scott. But they not only denied his case, they went on to say some extremely game-changing things. One thing the Supreme Court said was that Black Americans, even free Black Americans, were not American citizens, period. That if you were Black, you could not be an American citizen. And if you were not an American citizen, you could not technically sue in court. And so it's important because they're saying, hey, Dred Scott, you don't even have the right to sue us, to sue whoever in the first place. But think about the greater implications of this. No Black American is a citizen. But this is the first time that the government has said something so explicitly and so just this blanket ruling. The significance was enormous. The other thing that they said in the Dred Scott decision was that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional. It should have never even happened. Now, the Missouri Compromise, I don't know if I mentioned this specifically, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise. It just did away with it. Remember, that was part of the idea because instead of saying a territory in the North was automatically free, now it's going to be determined by popular sovereignty. So the Missouri Compromise by 1857 had been done away with for 3 years. But the significance of the Supreme Court saying that it was unconstitutional was this. They're making a statement that Congress does not have the power to make any decisions about slavery. And so think about it, up until this point, it has been entirely Congress that's made decisions about what territory can be slave and what territory can be free. Now the Supreme Court is trying to make the argument that the federal government does not have that authority and only states have that authority. Now think about who is going to be the most excited by that news and the most in favor of that news. The South right now, their biggest fear is the federal government being under the control of Northerners and the federal government trying to end slavery. But if the Supreme Court is saying that, no, Congress doesn't actually have that power, that is a huge win for the South. Because as individual states, they want to be able to retain their right to have slavery. They fear the federal government taking that right away from them. And so this Supreme Court case was an enormous win for Southern states and for the institution of slavery. Things just get more crazy from this point, including an event that is going to be carried out by one of the most radical abolitionists. John Brown was an abolitionist from the North, and he was actually very religious. That was part of his motivation. He believed that God was calling upon him to fight and end slavery. That was like his divine mission. But he believed that slavery could only be ended through armed resistance, through violence, through war. He actually got his start, his first experience with violence in the process of fighting to end slavery was at Bleeding Kansas. He was a prominent figure in the Bleeding Kansas events. So now John Brown in 1859 is going to organize a rebellion in Virginia. And the way he's going to start is he's going to gather a group of followers, and together he wanted to raid a federal arsenal. So remember, an arsenal is where weapons are stored. And so basically this means they were going to steal weapons from the federal government in Virginia. So of course that's treason. That's already incredibly risky. And the raid failed. And the whole reason they were doing this was because once they acquired those weapons, They wanted to arm slaves and start an armed slave rebellion. But while they were trying to steal the weapons, they were captured, most of them, or killed. And John Brown himself was actually executed for treason. In the South, he was feared, and this just triggered and enhanced Southern fears that armed slave rebellions might become more of a threat, might become more common, especially with these abolitionists becoming more radical and helping them. But for the North, Brown became a martyr, a hero. And check out this painting. This painting shows John Brown as like this larger-than-life figure, a Bible in one hand, a gun in the other. There's storms brewing behind. You can tell this is all set in the West. That's where the main kind of conflict over the expansion of slavery is happening, out there in the West. You've got your Confederate flag here, your American Union flag over here, all kinds of symbolism. In fact, this painting is called The Prelude. And so a prelude is like an introduction to something. And so this is showing the John Brown and the violence that broke out around him as the precursor of the Civil War. So what actually started the Civil War, if you want to think of like, I use this analogy a lot, I think, but a row of dominoes falling over, it just takes one domino to knock the rest of them over, right? Well, the dominoes are going to start falling with the election of 1860. And so in 1860, you actually have 4 major candidates for president, which is pretty rare. One of those candidates is Abraham Lincoln. He is running for the new Republican Party. There were 2 Democratic candidates, one from the North and one from the South, who had slightly different parties. In fact, here's Stephen Douglas. He's the one that proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But you have 2 candidates from the same party, and so if you're a Democrat, and you know that kind of weakens the Democratic Party because the Democratic vote's going to be split between these 2 candidates. And then you have another just random candidate from a random party that I've never even heard of. So in the election, Lincoln is running on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, not abolishing slavery, stopping the spread of slavery. This poster over here says, "Free territory for a free people." Even so, Southerners didn't quite believe this. They didn't quite buy this, and they thought that the election of Lincoln would be disastrous for them. That was what they feared, was the election of Lincoln. So when Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, it started to trigger some dominoes. The crisis unfolded quickly. In the next few months after Lincoln was elected, before Lincoln even became president. So, there's that time period after someone's elected, but before they take office. During this time period, 7 states secede from the Union, starting with, guess who? South Carolina. And so South Carolina just secedes in December of 1860, and in the next month and a half or so, they're followed by 6 other states. The president who served right before Lincoln was named Buchanan. Now, if you were Buchanan, what would you do? You only have a few months in office. You've got states seceding. This is certainly the beginning of Civil War. And so Buchanan did what a lot of us probably would do, and he just sort of threw his hands up. I think he probably did, little air guns at Lincoln and said, "Hey man, it's all you now. You got this." So Buchanan said he did not believe that states had the right to secede. Same thing that Jackson said. However, he did not see how the federal government was going to stop it. The federal government could do little to stop it without going into full-scale war. So these 7 states formed the Confederate States of America. They had their own constitution. They elected a president who was named Jefferson Davis. All of this happened before Lincoln even took office. When Lincoln did take office in 1861, in his inaugural address, he said this, and it's become a very famous quote: "In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." And so basically Lincoln's saying here, hey, the ball's in your court. If you want a war, you got to be the one to make the first move. I'm not going to be the aggressor. I'm not coming after you. But if you launch an attack, if you are the aggressor, then you better believe that we're going to defend ourselves. And so that happens at Fort Sumter in 1861. Fort Sumter was a federal base, and so what that means, it was in South Carolina, but before the states seceded and formed the Confederate States, federal bases that had been in the South, they were still going to be occupied by Union troops. From now on, we're going to call the North Union. Okay, it's a little confusing, but during the Civil War, when we say Union, it just means the North. So the troops that were at Fort Sumter were still United States Union federal troops. And so they were enemies of the Confederacy. But their fort was right there in the middle of South Carolina. And so at one point, the federal troops were trying to resupply Fort Sumter, send more weapons, things like that. And seeing this as a threat, President Davis of the Confederacy ordered Confederate troops to fire upon Fort Sumter. And so this starts the first battle of the Civil War. It actually ended up being a Confederate victory. The Union troops surrendered the battle, and it becomes the first official battle of the Civil War. So here's a painting showing the attack of Fort Sumter. Following the attack of Fort Sumter, 4 more states secede from the Union, making a total of 11, and those are going to be the states that make up the Union. You can see them highlighted right here. If you look closely right here, Virginia, I'm going to show you on the next map, Virginia actually splits, and we get the state of West Virginia, which stays in the Union, and here's why. Here's kind of a weird thing that a lot of people don't actually realize. There were 5 states that were slave states that did not secede from the Union. Remember, we talked before about the difference between the Upper South and the Deep South. Well, the Deep South is going to be your Confederacy states. But the Upper South, the border states, first of all, they have much, much, much fewer numbers of slaves. Their economy does not rely as heavily on slaves in these states like Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia. Slavery was not important enough to them to take the step of seceding from the Union. However, they got to maintain slavery because, well, Lincoln wasn't about to tell them that they had to end slavery. Lincoln wasn't even going to say that to the southern states that did secede. And so Lincoln is not going to ask these states to end slavery because he fears losing them too. He wants to keep them in the Union, whether they're slave states or free states. And so that is why we call them the border states and why there were some slave states in the Union. Virginia actually ended up splitting so that West Virginia could stay in the Union, but then Virginia, what was left of Virginia, would be a Confederate state. So this is obviously a story to be continued in the next chapter, but that is essentially the road to the Civil War and the most important events that started the Civil War, primarily happening in the 1850s. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your week. If you have any questions or any comments or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.